So now we go to the second part of our video lecture in Unit 6, and this is all about the application of validity measures in diagnostic and screening tests. Now, actually, for this part, this is just a continuation as to the different measures of validity that we will be using in your diagnostic and screening test. And actually, there are four. So you have your false positive and false negative results, sensitivity and specificity, your predictive values, and your likelihood ratios. Now, since we are done discussing about your sensitivity and specificity, mauna na for this video lecture na portion, tanggalo na nako na siya. But then again, part gihapon na siya ha sa measures of validity ninyo, pero since atuan naman na siyang na-lecture kaganina, rather sa ato ang previous or sa katong first part sa atong video lecture, so let us just focus on these three. Your false positive, your false negative result, your predictive values, and your likelihood ratios. Now, still we will be using your 2 by 2 contingency table as you can see here. Diri sa inyuhang left side. And nakasummarize na po diri tanan meaning sa inyuhang parcel and kani na portion tanan ninyong formulas na dapat i-remember. So let us begin with your false positive and your false negative result. Now, medyo na butangan naman ako ni siya og emphasis sa katong first part sa ato ang video lecture na di ba ngano issue man gyud ni si false positive and si false negative. Now, actually there is also ways on how we could actually compute for your false positive and false negative result. But then again, let us define first what are these two actually kay kato importance lang man to ang ako ang na-mention. So this time definition na gyud ang atong i-point out. Now as you can see, false positive error is also known as your type 1 error and your alpha error. Whereas for your false negative error, that is also known as your type 2 error and your beta error. Now starting with your false positive error, it is defined as if something is said to be true when it is actually false. Now, a false positive results when you find a positive result in a patient whom disease is absent. Actually, from the word in itself, false positive meaning, you are concluding that this patient has the disease when in reality, wala gyud man. How about your false negative error? False negative error if something is said to be false when it is actually true. And your false negative error results when you found out that a patient does not have the disease when actually it is present. So from the word in itself, false negative, so kaya siya false negative because we are concluding na wala when actually naa. So to give you a very direct and easy to remember example about the difference of your false positive and your false negative error or results, take a look at this image. Diba? Try to look at your type 1 error first. Oh, 'di ba si physician niingon siya sa isa ka old na male, you're pregnant. Which is actually very funny, right? Kay pwede ba day mabuntis ang tigulang ug ang lalaki? Ang tigulang na lalaki. Well, of course not. Then that is a false positive, telling your patient na you have this certain condition when in fact dili gyud siya. So another example for your type 2 error this time is with regards to this. So, di ba? Babae, obvious na pa jud kaayo, dako ang iyahang tiyan, and then you're telling that patient, oh, you are not pregnant. So that is an example of a false negative, telling your patient na wala siya ani na condition when in fact naa. Now, false positive and false negative result can actually be used in your hypothesis testing. Now, di ba when we say hypothesis testing, it is a statement of a null hypothesis and the selection of a level of significance. Now, medyo hawd man good siguro taan kay even during in your senior high school days ninyo na naman good may research. So when we say null hypothesis, diba, like for example, there is no significant relationship between Kani siya and kani siya na certain na outcome. Or pwede po dumingon tag walay effect ang kaning drug nato sa kanina disease. So that is your null hypothesis. And in fact, we can commit such errors sa kaning hypothesis testing ninyo. Mao man na siya ang common na term, di ba? Type 1 error and type 2 error. Di man gyud kay ta makadungog in terms of kaning hypothesis testing na false positive and false negative. But then again, it is still related. As mentioned, your false positive error or result is also known as your type 1. Your false negative is also known as your type 2. So, if i-define nato ni siya usab, in relation to hypothesis testing, your false positive result would happen when we reject a null hypothesis that is actually true. Diba? Reject. Whereas in your type 2 error, it happens when we fail to reject a false null hypothesis. And diba, for us to know if we need to reject or not, mao man ni siya, that actually depends on the level of significance. Now, if I could still recall, level of significance would actually refer, diba, to your p-value. When in fact, if it is less than 0.05, diba, you reject the null, and if it is greater than or equal to 0.05, then you don't reject your null hypothesis. And also, going back to sensitivity and specificity, remember how important sensitivity and specificity is in terms of trying to avoid, mo ni siya gi-emphasize na ako na siya diri trying to avoid this false positive and false negative result. So, you already know the meaning of your sensitivity and specificity, but just to give a recap, diba, sensitivity is reliably finding a disease when it is present, and it helps us avoid false negative result, while specificity reliably excluding a disease when it is absent, and it avoids your false positive result. So, false positive, false negative, sensitivity, and specificity goes hand in hand. Na, diba, the more dagko og ang sensitivity ug specificity ani sa inyuhang mga diagnostic and screening test, the more better, the more less good na naatay mga errors na makommit. Now, another thing that could actually affect our test result is with regards to the stage of our disease. So as you can see here, the stage of the disease often influences the test result. Now before I will further explain that one, so let me just continue on with the next 2 points here before nako siya i-explain pa. So very early in the course of almost any infection, a patient may have no immunologic evidence of infection, and tests done during this time may yield false negative result. Now, if you could still recall, a part of our discussion in Unit 4, kato sa inyo mga risk ratio, odds ratio, katong risk factors ninyo, and causation, iba na point out nato dito si latent period o si incubation period na because na ato ang mga sakit na ay mga incubation period, na ay mga latency times, 'di ba, it could actually hinder taking note of the temporal relationships. Now, this is actually almost the same as to why the stage of the disease influences test result, and it may give us kaning false, di ba, maka-yield og false negative result because of that kanang period of time gyud sa inyong mga sakit. Namang uban na sakit na pwede na harbor na siya or naa na sa atong body, but because dili pa enough ang number na present dira sa ato ang body, na dili pa siya tipong kaya ma-detect sa ato ang mga test, then mo na mahulog siya na false negative na may mga ingana na case. Mo na siya itong ginatawag na burden of the disease, na because the burden of the disease is not yet that great, na kaya dili siya na kaya mahulog na mo negative ta, kay syempre kani mga test nato naman pud ni sila kumbaga murag certain amount pud na ginatanaw sa ato ang body na before gyud na mo gawas na positive ta ani na mga certain test. So mao lang pud na siya ang nakadelikado Okay, again, it depends on the stage of the disease. It depends on the burden or the amount of the organism that we are carrying that it is able to be detected with the use of our available screening and diagnostic tests. Now, another false negative results may also occur late in infection, such as your tuberculosis, when the disease is severe and the immune system is overwhelmed and unable to produce a positive skin test result. And this event is what we call anergy. Now, let me explain what is anergy. Diba? When we say anergy, uh, it actually comes from the Greek word meaning not working, meaning there is inadequate immune system response. 'Di ba always remember your words? Na 'di ba pag naabi adyo na nakasulat na a or an sa first sa inyuhang mga words, then meaning ana wala. Now, since there is energy here, that could actually, 'di ba? Since since kato inadequate man ang inyuhang immune system response, then there may be cases na dili makita or mm, dili ma-detect sa ato ang mga test. And mahulog mo nang mahulog na mag-false negative na mo. So actually na ako specific example or specific ano pa mas gwapo na explanation for you to understand this energy and in relation to tuberculosis. So let us refer to this image. Now, before na aning mag-ingon ta og TB test, na di ba katong mag-submit mo og sputum and then tanawon yun, i-view yun siya under the microscope. One test that could actually help us in detecting or knowing na ang kaning isa ka patient kay na ay tuberculosis is your tuberculin skin testing. Now, sa old na tuberculin manggod na ginagamit, dili pa tong PPD na kapila na po na ko na siya na mention or I think kapila na mention po sa inyo ha, even in your PMLS 1. The old tuberculin actually poses a problem, especially in those living in southeastern United States. Since dito daw na area, daghan jud daw kayo naga-false positive na result. And it so happened na because of such thing, because kay kana lagi daghang naga-false positive, so syempre gipangitaan og paagi, so mo na here comes your PPD. Remember the meaning of your PPD, your purified protein derivative. Ma'am, unsa ang difference day atong aning PPD karon sa katong old tuberculin na ginagamit? PPD from the word itself, purified protein derivative, kumbaga murag ang gigamit ani is protein derivative na naa mismo dito sa inyuhang Mycobacterium na strain, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, whereas katumangong old tuberculin ninyo, heat concentrated to siya na filtrate sa inyuhang Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So ang nahitabo, gi-change nila, giwala tong old tuberculin, ang gigamit na karon is your PPD, and then gi-standardize na dayon ang diameter sa induration kaniot kay di ba skin testing gani siya, so naman na ma-observe na kung mag-positive gani mo ni mga induration. So gi-standardize karon ang diameter sa inyong skin induration para makaingon ta na naamoy positive na result na amoy tuberculosis. So dapat na daw na siya around ani na diameter, mga nasa 5 to 9 mm. Now, for many decades, wala gyud tay nakita na problema with this one. Muna na for pila ka years, mo jud ni siya ang ginagamit and then less likely kay ta na false positive result. But here comes AIDS. Here comes HIV. Now, by the time na nagkaroon ng HIV, mo man ni siya ang ginamin na ko ani na image, di ba mo man na magay possibility na magka-allergy sa mga HIV infected individuals. Actually, in my experience, during my work in the laboratory, mapansin yun kay na ko na every time gani ang kaning patient na ay AIDS or HIV positive siya, always kakabit yun ng magkaroon siya og tuberculosis. Dili kaayo na ako ma-remember kung sa good scientific na kanang reason behind, but number one atong tanawanan is diba immunocompromised biya ang mga HIV patient. Dali lang kay matakdan. So going back, because of the possibility of allergy in HIV-infected individuals, gi-recommend karon na i-lower pa ang katong recommended na diameter of induration sa inyong PPD na tuberculin skin testing para ma-consider gyud na positive ang inyong patient. And because of lowering this diameter, nibalik na nag-increase na po ang frequency sa inyong false positive result. One example ng ano na i-increase na false positive result na nahitabo, it's because of those patients taking BCG vaccine. BCG vaccine, BCG vaccine is actually for tuberculosis, diba? Pang anti-tuberculosis. Na syempre, pag magstorya ta og vaccine, ang content man gyud ana inyo mga vaccine is live attenuated na mga organism. And syempre because of that live bacteria that is being injected to you, then makita or makuha sa atong PPD na abig katugyod tong tinuod na tuberculosis. When in fact, katulang di itong bacteria na present because of the BCG vaccine that you took. So, di ba, nakita dira na somehow, sa kanay mga ingani na ginabuhat nato, there is always a trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. So, kana lang mo na nabantay-bantayan yun nato na we will always try to weigh down or weigh things out na kung asa ba yun ang better na ug asa most likely na makadetect yun ta og tarong na mas daghan og true positive kaysa sa false positive. Okay? Now, let's proceed to how we would compute for your false positive error and for your false negative error. Now, since we are talking about false positive here, syempre, number one na isipon ninyo, dili na to ni tan-awon si A ug si D. Di ba mo man ni siya ang sa inyong sensitivity ug specificity since we are looking at true positives and true negatives. Since this time around, we want to know kung kinsa to or pila gyud tong mga nag-false positive and nag-false negative, so try to look at this formula. Ay, sorry. Sorry po. Try to look at this formula. Diba? That is, dirita magtanaw, B, B over the total number of individual that does not have the disease. C over the total number of individual that has the disease. So, just remember that is the formula for your false positive and false negative. So, balik ta katong example na gigamit pud nato, diba, regarding serum level of calcium and katong na ay tinuod na disease status. So, ingani lang pud na siya. So, what would be your false positive error rate? That would be 5% for false positive and 40% for the false negative. So, looking at kani pa lang sa false positive error niya, actually, it is already good. Hindi ba, baba naman jud kay na ang 5% ninyo. Pero pagabot sa false negative, dara medyo magduwa-duha ta kay almost half biya sa percentage ang iyaha pong ma-detect. Okay? So now let's proceed to your predictive values. Now, predictive values describes the probability of having actual disease given the result of a test. Now, when thinking about your predictive value, just remember these two important clinical questions. So, kanina siya. Predictive value is different with sensitivity and specificity. Well, in fact, your sensitivity and specificity cannot actually answer these two questions. So, sa dining duha ka questions na imong pasabot, ma'am. Number one, if the test was positive, how likely is it that he really has the disease? Or, if the test was negative, how likely is it that he really does not have it or does not have the disease? So, atong ginatanaw diri, from the word itself na predictive, try na to predict na kanina certain individual, kung nag-positive siya, naabag yun. Kung negative siya, wala bagyod ang disease sa iya, ha? So, if you try to define uh, uh, Rather, there are actually two types of predictive values. We have your positive predictive value and your negative predictive value. Now, positive predictive value, or your PPV, indicates what proportion of the subjects with the positive test results actually have the disease, while your negative predictive value indicates what proportion of the subjects with negative test result actually do not have the disease. And this is how you compute for your PPV and your NPV. Now, try to look at mo ni ang formula if we base it with your 2 by 2 table, that is A divided by A plus B and D divided by C plus D. So if we try to look at this one, sa inyong 2 by 2 table, kanina siya. Actually, this is very easy to remember, ang formulas, 'di ba? Labi na kung mapansin ninyo, si sensitivity, diri ni siya, pababa. Tama? Wherein, ang tinatanaw nato sa sensitivity through positive, ang ginatanaw nato sa specificity through negative. If i-insert nato diri si false positive error rate o si false negative, ang ginatanaw na dayon nato do pababa gihapon siya, but this time around kaning naa sa false negative ug sa false positive. How about your positive predictive value and negative? Paing-ani ang atuang tan-awon sa iya ha. From left to right. Nga naman, since we are talking about who really have the disease, then syempre, ang i-base nato or ang i-denominator nato is katong total population na nag-positive. Or kung sa negative predictive value man, katong total number of individual na nag-test og negative. So mao na kung ato man ang i-redefine, not actually redefine, pero kung kanang isipon nato lang ba na kung unsa jud ning positive predictive value, but through positives divided by the total number of positive tests, while your negative predictive value is the true negative divided by the total number of those who had a negative result. Okay? So, balik taan ni na example. So, let us compute for the positive predictive value and the negative predictive value. So, kanilang po na siya. So, again, from left to right ta. So, that will be, diba, 12 divided by 15 for your PPV. And then, nara ay 57 divided by 65 for your negative predictive value. So, the result of our PPV is 80%, and then the result of your NPV is 88%. Okay? Now, if we look at the numbers, if we look at the result, 80% PPV, 88% NPV, diba? We won't actually be that confident enough in terms of sa inyong positive or negative test result. Okay? We are actually looking at prediction here. And 80 and 88% is actually low kay dapat 100% completely correcta in terms of predicting na ang atong positive test kay naa-dyo'y disease ug negative test gyud na wala. But then again, there's no such thing as perfect. Muna na somehow lisod gyud ning predictive value, lisod siya i-interpret, especially if there is presence gyud sa false positive or false negative na finding. And second, predictive value is actually greatly influenced depende sa prevalence pud sa inyong sakit. So ako lang po nang ma-emphasize more later, tabi na ko moabot na sa inyong likelihood ratio. And actually, in terms of the real setup, kanang tinud-anay na setting gyud sa lab, dili kay mo makadungog og kaning moingon og positive predictive ug negative predictive value. But it's nice to know na naapod tay certain computation that can be used in terms of predicting the predicting na magkaroon ba gyud siya ato na sakit or dili. So this is just another example as to computing for your PPV and computing for your NPV. So, this is an example of kanang predictive value of mammography as a screening test to know if naay breast cancer ang isa ka individual. So, as you can see here, PPV, that is again from left to right. So, that is 9. Tara, 9 divided by 108. Whereas for your NPV, that is 891 divided by 892. So, what would be our result? PPV is 8.3%, while your NPV is 99.9%. Hindi ba? Gwapo kayo nga tong NPV. Meaning na ay 99.9% na probability na kaning pagmugamit og mammogram na wala gyud mo'y breast cancer. Okay? So what is the difference now between sensitivity and specificity sa inyong predictive value? Now, sensitivity and specificity are characteristics of a test, whereas your predictive values, either positive and negative, are best thought of as the clinical relevance of a test. And kindly take note, predictive values are greatly influenced by the disease prevalence. So, na-mention ako ni kaganina, the higher the prevalence, the higher the predictive value. So, pakitandaan ani, so, mo day ni atong i-post na question. Diba, why should we be concerned about the relationship between predictive value and disease prevalence? Unsa di ay ang naa kay disease prevalence na ngano ma-influence magyud og taman ang ato ang predictive value? So, to answer that question, let us look at this table. Diba? This is showing the relationship of your disease prevalence to positive predictive value. So, for example, kunwari lang, ang katong test na itong gigamit kay 99% yung sensitivity, 95% iyahang specificity. And then, ato ang total population kay 10,000. Now, diri sa first na table nato, 1% lang ang disease prevalence. Diri sa second, na 5%. So, how would we compute or how would we fill in this table? Siyempre, since we are talking about prevalence, that would refer to the total number of people having the disease. So, based na diri sa inyong total population, so 10,000, i-times lang na ninyo sa 0.01, then we would get this result. While here, sa 5% na disease prevalence, so 10,000 times 0.05, then we would get 500. Siyempre, minus lang para makuha ninyo ang kaning inyuhang number of individuals that do not have the disease or are not sick. Now, giun sa pagkuha ning mga naa sa inyuhang mga numbers diri sa taas, kanilang, using your sensitivity and specificity. And diba remember that we have a sensitivity of 99% and thus, out of 100, na 99 dira na positive ang test and then isa lang sa negative. While here sa 500, na 495 and then na 5. Here sa specificity, diri na to na siya tan-awon. So, try to compute ha sa on your own para ma-double check ninyo. Basta gina-emphasize na nako sa inyo ha giunsa siya pag-compute. So, mo na namugawas ni na mga amount. So, karon, since we already fill in your tables kung sa to mga necessary na kailangan, let us now compute for your positive predictive value. Dun sa to pag-compute from left to right. So that is 99 dara. 99 divided by total number of patients with the which are positive. And then same here, 495 divided by 970. So, tanawan ninyo karon ang result. Sa katong na ay 1% na disease prevalence, the positive predictive value is only 17%, whereas those na ang disease prevalence 5%, ang iyang positive predictive value ni reach 51%. Diba grabe ang difference? So therefore, we could actually say na a certain screening program, kunwari mag-conduct ta og ka ng mga screening programs, mas okay gyud siya na i-direct sa mga high-risk na target population na katong na itaas gyud og disease na prevalence. Since, of course, since usually ka naman yung mga high risk, di ba, na population, sila man gyud na ang more motivated na mag-participate, and sila man pud na ang more likely na mag-take og action if ang ilahang screening test results kay positive. If ang atua manggong screening programs i-direct nato dito sa less ang mas baba og disease prevalence and low ang ilahang mga low risk na mga target population, it would be a very wasteful kay siya og resources. And since lesser man yung disease prevalence, then mas increase ang tendency na mas daghan ta og ma-detect na wala ato na sakit. So, di ba, kung isipon nimo kalas kaayo or sayang kayang effort na ato ang gibuhat na mahulog ra di ay na wala kayo tay ma-detect na disease. So, kana lang going back ato kung giingon, nga kato mga high risk population na mas motivated and mas more likely na mag-participate and mag-take into action, di ba i-relate nato na siya diri sa karon sa atoa na nagka-COVID. Di ba kung ang inyuha ganing barangay, kung gi-mention dito na hala ang barangay na kani kay sila ang daghan kayo nag-positive, di ba mas alert man gyud kay ta. And syempre kung moingon na hala i-test tanan dito ng mga kwan, di ba mas gusto man punta mag-participate kay we want to know if we also tested positive. I-compare na siya sa mga people na naa dito sa mga area na wala diri nag-positive na COVID, di ba? Unsay ginaingon? Okay ra man mi, wala may nag-positive diri. Nga kung naa may mga kun, sige lang kay wala mo pud mi na-expose, di ba? So makita ang difference na kaya every time na maghatag yun mo mga certain program, i-direct yun na siya sa kung kinsa to mga high risk ninyo na population. Muna, di ba, na before you actually give a certain program to a certain population, ang una man gyud ninyo buhaton na is to really interview and try to look at unsa man gyud ang problem na naa. Okay, what if di ay mag-ano mo, what if di ay kanang sitaw gani kanang mag-ano mo dito anti-bitok. Nga di ay pagabot dito sa inyong population, yan, siyempre nagpasa lagi daw kuno og kuan, but then again ni isa walay nag-positive sa kung unsa man na nabitok inyong gusto tan-awon. Or kunwari magpa health fitness program mo, nga pagabot ninyo dito sa inyong target na barangay or population kay puro man di ito mga physically active, di ba? You see the difference, you get my point na siyempre always nato i-focus katong mga programs, mga screening, mga health interventions sa kung kinsa gyud tong ato ang high risk na target population. Okay? Sige, padayon ta. Now we proceed to our likelihood ratio, and for your likelihood ratio there are actually two: likelihood ratio positive or your LR positive and your likelihood ratio negative or your LR negative. Now, starting with your LR positive, this is actually used to rule in disease. So later ako aning i-further explain na ako'y example. Now, LR positive is the ratio of the sensitivity of a test to the false positive error rate of your test. And the equation being used is actually this one. Now, either lang ni sa duha ha. Depende man gud na sa kung asa mo comfortable. Nga basi daig memorize jud kay ninyo ang kanang pag-compute sa inyong sensitivity formula sa inyong sensitivity ug specificity, then you can actually directly use the second equation. Or what if mas comfortable mo na isa-isahon gyud og memorize ang inyong formula na naagyo ni siya, then you can actually use the first equation. So then again, tama man gihapon ang duha. So in your likelihood ratio positive, the interpretation here is that the ratio must be larger than 1 for us to know that your test is good. How about your LR negative? LR negative is to rule out your disease. It is the ratio of the false negative error rate divided by the specificity. So nagapon mo duha, dire ka equation. Then again, you can use either one. If memorize ang inyong sensitivity specificity na formula, then pwede na lang dayon ning second equation. And for the interpretation of the result of your LR negative, this one baliktad. The smaller the value of your LR negative, the better the test is. So, kung atong i-table ni ang inyuhang result, so kanilang na siya. Diba? If you try to look at kani, the greater, the better. For your negative likelihood ratio, paki-correct dahi ko ani please. Dapat less than 0.1 lang na siya. Okay? Diba? And kani, the smaller the amount, the better. The greater, kani, smaller. And kanina dayon na ang ginamina na sa inyong test efficiency. 'Di ba? From low, kung naamo ani, kung ingani ang result sa inyong positive likelihood ratio, meaning dili kayo okay ang inyong test, di siya naka-efficient. Pero pag diri sa inyong negative likelihood ratio, kung mahulog og 0.1 to 0.2, then that is high or good efficiency. And then of course, kung mangutana mo naman, memorize ni yes of course. Because you will still be asked to give a conclusion or interpretation to your results. Okay? So let us now try to compare sensitivity, specificity, predictive value versus your likelihood ratio. Unsa man gyud ang difference ani nila? Sensitivity and specificity assess how good a test is at diagnosis of disease, while likelihood ratio predicts the risk of a disease for a particular test. Ma'am, naaman tay predictive value. Unsa po'y difference niya kay likelihood ratio in terms of predicting? So, diri na siya. Predictive value and likelihood ratio actually same. Naman siya both predicts risk of disease. Pero asa sila nag-differ? In terms of the prevalence of your disease, wherein your predictive value, di ba, as discussed a while ago, greatly affected siya, but for your likelihood ratio, dili na siya affected to your prevalence of the disease. Okay? Pero kung mangutanan mo na, ma'am, unsa na mo pagkabalo, unsa ang gamiton? Syempre sa inyong quizzes ug sa inyong exam, naman jud na sa question. Ibutang man gyud namo na kung sa inyong dapat pangitaon. Diba, what is the predictive value? Naman gyud na mga terms. Dili man kay pahulaon pud namo mo. Okay? So dili mo mag-worry ana na part. So let us take this one for example. Ha? There are actually three different tests that we can use in terms of trying to detect sepsis. Kung naay sepsis ang atong patient, your C-reactive protein or your CRP, your procalcitonin, and your white blood cell count. Now, try to look at the results. Kani siya ang result sa likelihood ratio negative, kani ang result sa inyong likelihood ratio positive. So, ang question karon, which test would be best to rule in infection? Which test would be best to rule out infection? So, literal lang ang terms na rule in and rule out ha. Rule in infection na meaning naa siya, ato na infection. Rule out infection meaning para makayunta na wala yun. So, balik ta katong sa interpretation. Diba? Rule in would refer to sa likelihood ratio positive, tama? And para makaingon ta na i-rule in siya, di ba ang atong interpretation dito dapat bigger or greater, no, dapat greater or larger ang inyuhang greater than 1. So, between these three, kinsa man na pinakadako na number? That is your procalcitonin having 3.56. Meaning, kani siya na test would be best to rule in infection. How about the rule out? Diba? Dapat sa rule out, si LR negative man ni, diba it should be smaller or closer to 0. Smaller than or less than 1. Almost close to 0. The better the test is. So, between these three, kinsa may na pinakagamay na value? Diba? Si CRP, which having a likelihood ratio negative of 0.36. Diba? Compare it with the other two, 0.58, 0.94. So, meaning, kung gusto ta mag-rule out of infection, it would be best to use CRP. So, mao na siyang ginamin sa rule in and rule out diri sa inyong likelihood ratio. Okay? So, just remember, if the LR positive of a test is large and the LR negative is small, diba? LR positive is large, this one. LR negative is small, this one. Then it is probably a good test. Labi na kung ang inyuhang kung ang tan-awon lang yun nato diri or ang inyuhang LR positive ug negative kay naa lang yun sa isa ka test, then kana makaingon jud ta na best na siya. Like for example, kunwari ang 0.36 day diri kay si procalcitonin, ya diri kunwari si CRP 0.58. So pwede ta moingon na hala, pati sa likelihood ratio negative kay okay pud si procalcitonin. So pwede na to ingon na siya na gyud ni atong best na test. Next, other than getting your likelihood ratio positive and your likelihood ratio negative, pwede po nato kuhaon actually ang ratio sa inyuhang LR positive sa inyuhang LR negative. So how do we do that? Just try to look at kanina part, kaning pinakababa. Gi-divide lang nato na inyuhang LR positive divided by your LR negative. Now, the purpose of getting this one is to obtain a measure of separation between the positive and negative test. And for our interpretation here, if it is less than 50, then that means na weak ang inyuhang test. And since diri pa lang sa atong example, ang ratio nato is 28.6, then that would mean that it is actually a weak test in order for us to conclude that there is a true disease. Okay? So now we go to our next. We are done with the different measures of validity. So again, nato'y upat, false positive and false negative, sensitivity, specificity, predictive value, and your likelihood ratio. Now we proceed with this one, your receiver operating characteristic curve. Now, balik ta dito sa inyuhang cut-off point. Diba, na-mention man nato ang importance sa cut-off point. Cut-off point can actually be determined by using or by computing your likelihood ratio. And when we say cut-off point, it is the limit at which something is no longer applicable or possible. So that is how we define cut-off point. So, unsa day karon? Unsa ang naa kay receiver operating characteristic curve in relation to cut-off? A receiver operating characteristic or your ROC curve is the method used to decide on a good cut-off point. So, mao na ni siya. Isa na ni siya sa maka-explain sa kung saan na to pag-set og cut-off point yun sa atong mga test. Now, ROC curve can be considered a graph of your LR positive. Ma'am, ngano graph man? Since ang ginagamit, di ba, as mentioned here, it can be determined by likelihood ratio, and kung maging specific ta kung unsa na likelihood ratio ang ato ang ginagamit pang determine, that is your LR positive. Now, the best cut-off point is this one. Point closest to the upper left corner, representing a sensitivity of 100% and a false positive error rate of 0%. So, try to look at this graph. Diri sa baba is inyuhang false positive error rate. Diri sa inyuhang pikas is your sensitivity. Now, if mubalik ta sa definition sa best cutoff, point closest to the upper left. Kinsa ba ang nadiri sa inyong left side? Si sensitivity. Ngano dapat na siya sa upper left? Kay naga-indicate man pud good na naamoy 0% diri na false positive error and namoy 100% na sensitivity. So if you try to look at this curve, this is actually referring to your BP. Kinsa man ang atong best cutoff diri? Kinsa man ang nearest to your upper left corner? That would be kani inyuhang 140 mmHg. Ma'am, nga no. Kung tan-awon man gud ninyo aning 150 and 160, grabe kataas pa og error rate. False positive error rate. Ma'am, kani man lagi si 160 duol man siya og 0. But then again, try to look, grabe kababa siyang sensitivity, na lang sa 40%. Kung kay 150 ta, baba pagihapon na pa ni siya sa mga siguro ingon nato 50%. Now, how about kani? Ma'am, si 130, abot man siya almost 90, pero iyahang false positive error rate almost na diri na part, na sa 40%, even your 120. Syempre, mangita man gyud ta na naa dito sa midway. Diba, kumbaga, mura lang gud tag mo meet halfway sa iyaha na makonsider na nato og best. So, between these 5 different values, ang pinaka-okay na gyud diri na mo meet halfway sa ato na makahatag na og better na sensitivity and lower false positive error, that would be your 140. Nakuha? Okay. So let's proceed with this. O, di ba? What if hatagan mo og daghan ng mga test like parehas ani na ato ang example kani upat ni siya o upat ka test. Syempre, kani pa lang na line ninyo crush out na siya. Why? So you can see that is a no benefit line. What do we mean by a no benefit line? Meaning to say na ang inyong sensitivity og false positive error rate at the same level. Kung 20 ang inyong sensitivity, naalang po sa 20 inyong false positive error rate. So, pangit na siya. Next, kisa man ang pinakaduol yun sa inyong upper left. Walay lain. Very obvious pa lang diri sa inyong curve, di ba? Na kani si circle ninyo, si darkened circle, o yun na inyong excellent curve. Okay? Almost near to 100 na sensitivity and almost 0 pag yun siya na false positive error rate. Okay? So, kumuhatag taan na og another example pag yun, kani, another specific example. This ROC curve is for a test to determine malignancy status of follicular thyroid tumor based on its diameter. Now, duha ka tawo ang ato ang ginatan-aw diri. Older individuals and younger individuals. Diba? Mo man na greater than 50, ang kaning dili darkened na circle that is less than 50 years old. Kaning mapansin ninyo na numbers diri, this is referring to the diameter sa tumor. So, as you can see, sa tumor, katong na ay tumor diameter na 4.5 centimeters, ang sensitivity sa older patient is at most, kunwari nasa 75%. Sa mga bata, na lang about sa 35%. And then, kung tanawon pa jud ninyo diri sa older na individuals or older na participants, 0% pa gyud iyang false positive error. Pero dito sa mga younger ones, nasa mga 25. How about sa katong na ay 3.5 centimeters na diameter sa tumor? So, kung tanawon nimo kanina sa older na individual na agyapon sa about mga 75, pero ang iyahan ng false positive error rate na nasa mga 20. While diri sa mga younger ones, ang iyahang sensitivity na lang sa mga 65. Tapos ang false positive error pa jud na almost 45. How about kay 3.0? Kay 3.0 na centimeter o na sa nasa 100% na sensitivity sa mga tigulang. Pero ang ato apong tanawon ana ang false positive error na apod almost sa 40. Whereas sa mga bata, ang 3.0 cm diameter sa tumor nasa mga 60. Ang iyaha pa yung false positive error nasa 60. Now, how can we compare these different tests? How would we know or how are we able to determine na kanina diameter better for each? We look at the area under the curve. O, kids ha, literal na siya. Kung yung tag-area under the curve, kung mo ni ang curve, so mo ni siya ang area. Now, the area under the curve is the method of comparing your test, and it uses a statistical test of significance to decide if the area under one curve differs significantly from the area under the other curve. Diba? Each curve represents different participants or different tests as of this one. Duha man ta ka curve ani sa katong mga tigulang and sa katong mga bata. So take note of this. The greater the area under the curve, the better the test. So balik ta karon diri sa ato ang graph. Syempre kani si no benefit line, since naman gyud siya sa tunga, kaning area sa iyahang area under the curve na man na siya sa 50% na. Tan-awad dayon diri sa mga bata kani. We could actually estimate na area under the curve na sa mga 60%. Gamayng ligas lang man na siya sa no benefit line. How about diri sa mga old? Dara man iyang curve. So meaning ing ani kadako ang iyahang nakuha or ang area under siyang curve. So pwede ta mo ingon na agyud ni sa mga 90%. Diba? Kay dara na lang biyang nabilin na sa 90%. So unsang ginasuggest ani karon? So this data would actually suggest that for older patients, ang size sa tumor could actually help decide whether or not O ang size sa tumor kay maka-help siya og pa-decide sa mga surgeons na if there is already a need to remove that tumor for assessment. Whereas sa younger na mga patient, ah ang tumor diameter dili maka-help sa decision. So, mao lang na ang ginamin aning area under the curve. So, I hope nasabtan to siya. So, now we proceed to the last part. O, di ba? Hapit na gyud ta mahuman. Last part of our Unit 6, and that is the measures of reliability. Measures of reliability or agreement. Reliability and agreement is actually almost the same. When we say reliability, it is a measure of the consistency of a certain method. Diba? Reliable or consistency, diba? Mura ni siya og katong in relation to your precision, na diba other word or other name or other term biya na sa inyong precision. So tan-awon nato diri how much nag-agree or how much nag-agree or how much consistent ang inyong mga result. Kaya diba, not only do we want our measurements to be accurate, we also want to get the same answer every time na mugamit ta ato na instrument for measuring a certain test. Mao man na actually ang isa sa atong ginatanaw diri na labi na kunwari ako nagpa-test ko for FBS. Nya ang nigawas na result ako the first running is naa sa 3. And then the next running kunwari nagpa-repeat lang gi-repeat lang nimo ang test just to make sure na siya kanikalit og 10. 'Di ba? Do you think na kanang valid na siya? 'Di ba makulbaan ka kay hala kaganina normal niya nikalit lang na dili. So mo ni ang ato ang isa na dapat tan-awon ang agreement or reliability sa ato ang mga instruments or method na ginabuhat. When in fact, even before you can establish validity, you need to establish also reliability. And actually, just to point out also, reliability is not a proof of validity. Kumbaga, two observers can report the same readings, but both observers could also be wrong. So, muna na dili pud pasabot na consistent, meaning valid na pud dayon to siya. And another pagyud di ay, kaning measures of agreement or reliability, this is actually referring to katong i-control nato ang variability in terms of katong inter-observer and intra-observer. So, diri nato na siya makontrol na dapat makita nato kung unsa ka reliable or unsa ka dako ilahang ang percentage sa ilahang agreement with each other. So, muna na kanina siya ang ato ang ways of measuring your agreement or reliability, your overall percent agreement, which can be divided into two parts. Pwede ta mag overall percent agreement pag paired or pag naay multiple variables. And lastly, your kappa test ratio. So start ta with your overall percent agreement. Now, overall percent agreement or your OPA, si OPA, di ba OPA, common way to measure agreement, and the interpretation of your OPA, if 90% of the observations are in cells A and D, then that is equivalent to an overall percent agreement of 90%. Sige lang, ako lang po na siyang i-explain further later pag naanatay mga examples. So what is the drawback of using overall percent agreement when computing for measuring reliability? Number one, it does not indicate prevalence. It does not show how this agreement occurred, and agreement might be due to chance alone. Kumbaga, pwede na to i-equivalent inyong overall percent agreement sa katong na-discuss nato with regards to absolute risk. Na, diba? Absolute lang. General lang yun kaya atong ginatanaw. Na, diba, sa inyong absolute risk gani, dili nato ginatanaw ang katong non-exposed. The same here with your overall percent agreement. Dili pod nato ginatanaw ang katong na disagreement na nahitabo. So start with the paired observation. Now, how or what is the formula for your overall percent agreement if it is a paired observation? When we say paired observation, meaning na lang may duha ka observer. Now, before na ako i-explain how we come up with the formula, try to look at first your 2x2 table. Try to look at how siya nag-arrange. This time around, wala mo'y nakabutang diri na disease and then result. Kay since ang atoa diri is ang agreement na biya. So sa makita ninyo, observers na ni. Observer 1, observer 2, positive, negative. So meaning ang counting diri sa inyong cells, kung tan-awon nato diri sa letter A, pila to ka ah, pila ka test na pareho si observer 1 ug observer 2 nag-conclude na positive siya. Or kung diri pila to ka test na si observer 1 ug observer 2 pareho nag-agree na negative to siya. So mo ni siya nga atong ginatan-aw, mo ni siya inyong 2 by 2 table. So please be careful. Mag-matter ba gyud kay na sa inyong pag isa na sa among bantayan. Isa na sa among checkan ang kanang pag-create ninyo sa inyong 2 by 2 na table. So going back, now, as you can see here, kanina actually, ang first na percent agreement na calculation na ato ang na-come up, but dadagan natin kailangan i-consider diri. Ngano ma'am, ngano dako kay ni si D? Kaning pagpadako kay D diri, this is actually referring to the number of individual, the number na kung asa na ay mas daghan na value. And syempre diri sa D, di ba both negative man ni siya. Now, if we try to look at in the general population, di ba most persons who are tested na magyud ay negative na result. Di ba? Again, in general, dili man gyud na daghan. Kung labi na kung kana lang kung wala tay certain target na anyone in the population magpa-test, daghan man gyud na ang negative. So muna na that is actually shown here in our cell. Mo na in proportion to the number of people, mo nang dako ni si D. When you are trying to compute for percent agreement, i-ignore dapat nato ni si cell D. Ma'am, ngano dapat i-ignore? Since syempre, as mentioned, i-expect man gyud nato na daghan og negative na test result, meaning dako pud ang value na mabutang diri na inyong observer 1 ug observer 2 kay mag-agree. And it could actually affect your overall test result. Na abi ninyo, kung naamang good mo'y dako na value, pwede man good makonsil niya ang significant na disagreement or agreement yun na nahitabo diri sa inyuhang pag-compute. Kaya di ba kung nabiya mo'y dako kayo na value sa isa mo, dako pud ang inyuhang end na result. And ambi ninyo na tinud-anay or tama gyud to inyong result, well actually ang naka-affect lang di ay nangano ni dako siya kay tungod lang sa isa ka value. So muna na i-ignore nato ni siya. And then ang tandaan na lang dayon ninyo na formula, and which is the correct formula actually for your overall percent agreement is this one na sa inyong letter D. Nagets ba to kids? Ha, unta nagets ang katong pagka-explain ako ng ano siya i-ignore? Ha? Kung na may questions again, do not forget to post lang sa inyuhang sa atoang content forum. Basta then again, kahit ako man siya og value, pwede siya maka-obscure sa real na result. Kay since dako man ang inyuhang letter D, then mo expect yun na jud ay dako na final result, then pwede na dayon magkaroon og inaccuracy sa ato ang pag-interpret. So to prevent that one, since again most of the general population ang agreement man gyud ana sa inyong observer 1 ug 2 kay negative, kay dili man gyud always na tanan daghan jud kay tao diba na magkasakit, then di na nato na siya i-appeal sa ato ang computation. So again, to compute for your percent agreement, that would be A divided by the total, divided by A, B, and C times 100. Next, how about multiple variables? Unsa ang ginamin ani? When we say multiple variables, kana ganing ani ang result na inyong makita sa inyong test, dili lang positive negative, dili lang positive negative daghan. So parehas ani na abnormal, suspect, doubtful, normal. Nabi pwede mga ingani na test na daghan og kanang possible na readings na pwede ihatag. So ingani lang pud. Ang basehan lang po jud ninyo aning multiple variables is again, asa lang po jud to nag-agree. Kaya diba overall percent agreement biya netong ginatan-aw. So mo na kung makita ninyo diri na ay naka-box, diba again kung asa lang nag-agree, so kinsa tong asa to banda ang pareho si observer 1 ug observer 2 na nag-agree sa abnormal, nag-agree sila pareho diri sa suspect, sa doubtful and normal. And then you just add up everything divided by the total readings. times 100. Okay? So now we proceed to your kappa test ratio. Now, kappa test ratio measures the extent to which agreement exceeds that expected by chance. How much better is the agreement between two observer readings than would be expected by chance alone? So, muna siya nga to ang question sa atuang kappa test ratio. What is the most that the two observers could have improved their agreement over the agreement that would be expected by chance alone? Ma'am, sige ginamin aning chance. Unsa dayeng naa aning chance alone? Kana lang kumbaga, out of the 100, unsa ang mura po na siyang odds, unsa ang odds or chances na pareho na nag-agree ang kaning inyuhang kuan na tungod lang out of chance lang yun. Literal na siya na word na out of chance. And this is how we compute for your kappa. Na may percent agreement observed minus percent agreement expected by chance alone divided by 100% minus percent agreement expected by chance alone. So, ang question nato diri karon is how to get this one. Diba kay kabalo naman mo sa unsaon pag-compute so percent agreement observed. Oo, more lahi dayto sa inyuhang kuan. Sorry ha. Let me correct that one. Both day ni ang atuang tan-awon kay overall percent agreement man dayto kaganina. So anyway, let's proceed with the example for you to have a better understanding on how to compute your kappa test ratio. So kunwari kani, this is an example of grading classification of your histological na mga samples na total subtype of 75 non-small cell carcinoma being read by your pathologist A and your pathologist B. Now, first is we want to know the percent agreement observed. So, syempre, since we are talking about percent agreement, ang tan-awon lamang yun nato diri is nasa inyuhang cell A and cell D. Kaya nga no, diri man na nagpareho sila, agree na grade 2 ang ilahang classification, and diri po na part pareho sila nag-agree na grade 3 ang kanina na classification ani na slides. So, muna sa makita ninyo diri pagka-compute, 41 plus 27 divided by the total number of slides read times 100. So we have our result, 90.7% agreement observed. Now, medyo diri ang challenging. Sa percent agreement expected by chance alone. Diba? So, unsaon day ni siya pag-compute? Mura ni siya gingani. Since diri sa grade 2 na classification ni pathologist A, about 60% sa slides ang iyahang na read na nasa grade 2 na classification. The same thing with, and then sa grade 3, the same, about 40%. So, mo ni siya inyuhang bantayan. Now, kung makita ninyo ang sulod sa cells, nag-change ang numbers. Kay kumbaga, murag gusto man gud nato tan-awon diri, how much agreement would have been expected solely on the basis of chance. So, we would expect that pathologist A would read grade 2, both 60% of the slides that pathologist B had. In the same way, na about 40% pod ang mabasa ni pathologist A sa grade 3 na naa didto pod sa gigradean og grade 3 ni pathologist B. So muna na, when you try to compute, ingani yung buhaton. First, how did we come up with 26.4? Kaning 60% ni pathologist A, yun ang i-times sa 44. So, murag ang mahitabuan na, 44 times 0.60. And then, how did we come up with 18.6? Ang inyo halang pong buhaton ana kani. From the total number of kanang grade 3 na giread ni pathologist B, expect nato na about 60% na iyahang ma-rate og grade 2. So, mo nabutang nato 31 times 0.60. Then you would come up with these results, 26.4 and 18.6. So, kindly double check ha. Punta na mo yung calculator while nagapaminaw. Next, how about kanina part? So, syempre, kay since sa grade 3 naman ni ang 40% na po na nga to ang pang-compute dira. So, meaning, si pathologist A, Since sa grade 3 na siya mga 40% dira na na-read, so about 40% po na iyahang maklasify as grade 3 sa 44 na total slides ni pathologist B na giiyahang na-come up as classified as grade 2. So, mo na ang buhaton ninyo, ana, 44 times 0.40. And then the same here sa baba, 31 times 0.40. So, mo na dayon ni ang inyuhang answer sana, 17.6 and then 12.4. Now, since we've already filled up our table with regards to the percent agreement expected by chance alone, then butang na dayon nato again kanilang gihapon na kay di ba agreement ba gihapon na atong ginatanaw, so kanilang po nang duha ang values nato ang i-add up. 26.4 plus 12.4 divided by the total number na 75, then we have the percent agreement expected by chance alone of about 51.7%. So, since na naman tay values atong kailangan nato to compute for your kappa test ratio, we proceed now to computing your kappa test. So, para makita, i-erase lang sana ko ha. Erase na to ni para maklaro ninyo. Okay. So, as you can see, substitute na lang ta. 90.7% agreement observed minus the 51.7% sa katong chance expected by chance alone, and then 100% minus 51.7%, then our kappa test ratio now here is 0.81. Natay interpretation for kappa test ratio, but before that, actually ang next na ko, kanina next na slide na ko is a video showing how to compute for another way of computing. Kaya di ba medyo complicated manggod kaayo to kaganina. Actually na ako yung another way of computing katong inyuhang percent agreement by chance alone. Now, dili na lang na ako ni siya i-play. Kaya medyo nagka-problema mong ko with regards to audio na naa mismo sa inyong slide. Gitry manggod na ako sa kaganina. Di yun siya mo play. Ambot ay mo play siya pero wala jud audio. So ako na lang pud na siyang ako lang ning ibutang pud sa canvas under ani na video lecture para inyong ma-view usab. Pero diretso na lang pero ako na lang pud mag-explain sa inyo ha. So balik ta diri. Erase na ako ni tanan mga annotations na akong gibutang diri para mas ma-explain na ako another way on how to compute. Okay. Sige. So bali ingon ani siya. Kay di ba, sa pagka-compute manggod nato diri sa percent agreement expected by chance alone, need pa nato i-divide kato i-divide isa-isa para makuha nato ma-fill in ni nato og new na values ang naa sa sulod. But actually there is another way. Na dili na ninyo kailangan i-change pa ang values na present. Balik ta diri sa inyuhang table B. So this is how you compute for your percent agreement expected by chance alone without the need to place new values here inside your table. The first thing, tanaw ta diri sa inyuhang kani kay 45 ug kani sa inyuhang 44 kay grade 2 both. So bali ang buhaton nato ana, first divide 45 divided by 44 times diri dayon sa both na naa kay grade 3. Ay wait lang kids ha. Dili day ni siya mao. Balik ko na ako. So kani day na siya. Grabe ka rosa akong video no, unedited ni. So bali, another way of getting your percent agreement expected by chance alone is through this one. Let us look at grade 2 na classification ni pathologist A. So, murag nga ninyong buhaton sa grade 2 sa ata na classification. So, murag inyong buhaton, pila to ang total na gi-classify sa grade 2 ni pathologist A divided by sa total. So, murag ingani ang kinalabasan. And the same way pud ha sa inyong pathologist B. So, murag ingani na yung kinalabasan, 45 divided by 75 times kay pathologist B na 44 divided by sa total na readings na 75. Plus, ang next na to na tan-awon na ni is sa inyuhang grade 3. So, ang buhaton ninyo ana 30 divided by 75 sa total na reading times kani kay pathologist B pila iyahang counting sa grade 3 nag-classify niya, so that is 31 divided by 75. So, let us try to compute. Ako lang pong i-compute diri og mano-mano ha, kay para dili ta magkamali. So actually, if you try to compute, times 100 gyapon ni siya ha, kay percent biya nga atong ginakuan. Actually, after na ma-compute ninyo ni siya, again, remember this is plus, mukha map gyapon ta og the same na answer na 51.7. Okay? Diba? Asa man ang mas easier para sa inyo ha? This one or this one? Actually, both valid. So, balika or tanawa lang yun ninyo tong video na ako about this one. But then again, do not forget to multiply it by 100 since we are trying to get the percentage. Okay? So, unta na-gets to siya. Again, kung wala, please do not hesitate to comment sa content forum nato. Kay basig na ako'y or nakulangan mo sa akong pagka-explain. So, pwede ramang yun kayo na mo explain kung usab para sa inyo ha. Okay? So, then again, skip na nato ni siya. Proceed to with the interpretation. So, this is how you interpret your kappa. Now, actually, for this one, kanina interpretation, you need to really remember unsayahang katumbas na agreement. So, syempre, kung mag 1 na siya or 0.81 to 0.99, that is almost perfect. Kung mag exactly 1 yun na siya, then, of course, perfect na yun. So, 0.61 to 0.80, that is substantial. 0.41 to 0.60, moderate. 0.21 to 0.40, fair. 0.01 to 0.20, slight. And if it is less than 0, then that is less than chance agreement. So, again, you need to remember this one. Okay? So, going back. Now, ang result nato kaganina sa atong example is 0.81. So, how we would conclude or give an inference for this? So, we could say that pathologist A and pathologist B have an almost perfect agreement on the results of the histologic classification by subtype of the 75 slides of non-small cell carcinoma with a kappa statistic of 0.81. Diba? Baliktad dito sa atong interpretation. Asa ba mahulog ang 0.81? Darabya na siya. Diba? Almost perfect agreement. So that is what kappa test ratio is all about. And that actually ends our discussion for your Unit 6. So, naanapod mo yung additional na formulas to remember. But then again, midterm period na ni siya. So, dili ninyo kailangan iagad-agad og study or review ni siya. Then again, time management lang pod. Kay after your exam week, proceed na dayon with the quiz. Kindly also check for your laboratory activity. But for the laboratory activity, ang submission mo po na is of course still after the prelim exam week. So, a gentle reminder, kids. O, diba? Since exam week, prelim exam week is fast approaching, so all I want to say is for you to keep calm and study hard. Ha? God bless everyone. Thank you for listening.